All right, next up we've got a great talk, what is the problem in New Zealand? So this will be Andrew from the Kiwi Bitcoin Guide. If you haven't been to kiwibitcoinguide.org, I would suggest that you do. It's a great open source project with resources and information from a New Zealand Bitcoin lens. So yeah, get into that. But here is Andrew.
Hello everybody, my name is Joe Bryan. I'm ever so sorry I can't be with you at Bitkiwi today. I'm in the UK, it is quite a way, but I'm certainly there in spirit, and thank you all very much for the attention for the next presentation. It's very kind of Andrew Wells to present to you what's the problem, and you know, it's still very strange that people around the world have taken the materials that are created and iterated and then start educating other people on this topic. So thank you very much to Andrew Wells, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to watching the recording hopefully. But also, you know, good luck down there in New Zealand. You know, every country in the world is fighting their own separate battle when it comes to driving Bitcoin adoption within the cultural and the political and the regulatory backdrop that you find yourselves in. And every country is unique, but I'm really positive about what is happening down in New Zealand. You know, I've spoken to a number of the people who are talking to you today, and you know, they're making real headway on access to banking, payments, and the rails, and also the education around this topic. So I hope you're having a wonderful day. Hopefully I'll be with you next year, and thank you again to Andrew Wells. I hope you enjoy what's the problem.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for coming. First up, thanks to everybody for making the journey from the South Island, North Island, West Island, and other islands. And big thanks to Paul and Dan for, making what I think is the heart of the New Zealand Bitcoin community beat. Yeah, it's awesome. What's the problem? So, Joe Bryan, kind of a video that blew up really in the last month, created this video about the problem. And for any of us that talk about Bitcoin, it's really easy to get stuck in these rabbit holes and discussions about technical stuff, and you see the people's kind of eyes kind of glaze over. And so when I saw this video from Joe, it was just before Bitkiwi, and I thought, wow, that's something that we can talk about at Bitkiwi. So now, who's seen the video? Good number? Maybe just under half? Excellent. So the homework after today will be to go watch the video if you haven't seen it, and I'll show you some bits of it and give you just talk about some things from a New Zealand perspective. And I'll just have to do a bit of juggling from on the presentation as I click through. And Joe made himself fully available. He shared his slides and obviously recorded that really nice little group intro for us. And it's an open source project as he describes it. And his goal is to share it for people around the world to learn about the problem and a solution.
Welcome to What's the Problem? So what is the problem? Well, too many, unfortunately. I probably could have written twice as many things down on this slide. I think we all have that sense of unease We all feel internally that things are not moving in the right direction in our lives, in the world. Like things are becoming harder, not easier. And I think for most of us, we recognise some elements of these things on the screen as touching our lives directly or indirectly. And what I'm here today to show you is that all these things may seem unconnected. They're really not. The primary cause of all of these is the quality of our money.
So that's where it starts. And if we're in New Zealand, what does that look like for us? There could be lots of examples of that, but things that I can see, things that maybe you can see: housing availability, housing prices, poverty, cost of living, migration. We notice we're in a migration, we're in that brain drain again. People are leaving New Zealand. I remember for a long time that happened, and then for a while it turned around, but it's happening again. But like, as Cody was saying, as others say, people feel there is a problem and they can see things around them, but it's hard to dig in and try to understand why.
We're going to do this through a story. So imagine there's this far-off world where you have hundreds of smart people travelling on a ship, and this ship gets wrecked on a deserted island. This deserted island is so far from everywhere else they're effectively cut off, but the island is resource rich. It has everything they could possibly need to rebuild society. But because these people have come from an advanced civilization, they know exactly where they're ultimately going to get back to. But now they're starting again with nothing. What's also clear is that they need some way of trading with each other once they start to rebuild. So they prioritise deciding on what to use their new money. And suspend your disbelief slightly further in that they have, despite not having anything, the ability to create whatever monetary system they want with whatever characteristics. So the first question they need to answer is, what makes good money? But whatever they want.
So that's something that most of us probably haven't thought about. I was staying with a friend of mine here. I was having breakfast with him this morning, and I told him I was doing a presentation here about Bitcoin, and he was asking what I was going to talk about. I was going to talk about our money and looking at the quality of the money. What's a good money? What's a bad money? Most in this room, many of us have probably thought about that, but lots of people we try to talk to about wider problems or Bitcoin maybe haven't. And there are some qualities of money, and the one that we all kind of hone in on is scarcity. So, talking to my friend, I was saying, well, New Zealand dollars, they are just created out of thin air. There's nothing scarce about them. Portable, got to be able to move it around. We can kind of do that all right. Divisible, a dollar goes into 100 cents, easy. Bitcoin goes into 100 million sats, easier. Lasting, fungible, means it doesn't matter which one you've got, they're all the same. Acceptable, and again, for our dollars in New Zealand, mostly that works. But if we're looking at a perfect money, it's all of these things. And this is where Joe's gone with this. He's just starting off from a perfect money, so that kind of got me thinking.
But then there's a disagreement. Two leaders emerge from within the population. The first, Satoshi, he says, well, given these are the characteristics of perfect money, that's going to be true today, true tomorrow, and true forever. So we should lock them in, it should never change. Whereas Fiatella, he says, well, I get that. I get this is the characteristics of perfect money, and I totally agree. But what if there's an emergency? What if we need to change something? What if the people we've got in charge of our money
feel like it's not working and need to make an adjustment. I think we should have the perfect money, but we should also have a big red button, which allows someone to press it and change any of the characteristics if we need to. Of course, no one ever will, but just in case.
So, what would a big red button look like in New Zealand? We had one 4 years ago, and it was called, 5 years ago? 4 years ago. It was called that, large scale asset purchase. They don't call it a big red button, they give it a really complicated sounding name. I pulled some information from the Reserve Bank website, and that's what they say, that they had the ability to create up to $100 billion. And in the end, they created, and this is where I sit there with my friend and say, imagine you're playing Monopoly, and the banker just whips out 50 billion extra dollars and throws it on the board. You know, that's what happened. That $53 billion, it goes through a few places, and they have all these words for it, like open market purchases, but it's basically one side of the government creating money and the other side of it receiving it and borrowing it. But of course, there's room for commercial bank spreads in the middle, isn't there, James? And I did some, just rough calculations. That's 15%. So of all the New Zealand dollars that have existed from, the last 50 odd years, the New Zealand dollar has been around, they made 15% more of them. And I was having this conversation with my father, and I said, so you retired, you've got a pool, he's not working anymore, you've got a pool of money, capital savings that represent his life's work. It's now worth 15% less. And that was just in 2021. So that's our big red button.
This becomes an irreconcilable disagreement. So a fairly drastic solution, but they build a huge wall right down the middle of this island, and on one side, they create a currency called Satoshis, which is perfect money always. And on the other side, fiatelos, which is perfect money, but with the options changing. Now this wall is so big, it cuts off the communication and the trade between both sides of the island. So effectively, they're cut off from one another. So to begin with, nobody has anything on either side of the island. So everyone's starting from zero. And initially, people have to be self-sufficient. Each person is fishing for their food, cutting down trees for the wood to make fires, and also the houses, and then they're also building their own shelters. Now, even though they have perfect money, there's very limited trading here because people are working hard just to satisfy their day-to-day needs across all of these goods. But people are different. Some people are better at some things than others. And so people quickly realise that if I spend my time focusing on the things I'm good at, and reducing the amount of time I spend on things that I'm poor at, then I can contribute more to society. I can increase the amount of goods I can provide to society in the same amount of time as the average person. So the woodcutter spends all his time now cutting down wood. He stops fishing, he stops building shelters. And because he's spending his time cutting down wood, he increases the quantity of wood available to everyone else versus 3 people spending a third of their time each. Because he's good at it. And not only does the increase in the quantity of wood available reduce the price of wood for everybody on the island, the quality is also high. He's better at doing it. He produces a higher quality output. So prices fall and quality increases. And not only that, he's not the only woodcutter. There are multiple woodcutters. So they're all competing to supply wood to everybody else, and they're competing with price and in terms of quality. And now what happens is, because the woodcutter needs other goods to survive, he has to sell the wood to buy fixtures, to sell the wood to pay for the services of the home builder. So now everybody is actively trading in this perfect money. Now, because processes continue to improve, the woodcutter can now satisfy the needs of the rest of the population for wood in a smaller amount of time. He can then take that time and think about his own processes, his own innovations. Maybe he can make cutting down wood even more efficient. And if he does that, it drives prices lower. It drives quality higher. Maybe he reaches the end of his innovation within his woodcutting and then uses the excess money, excess capital he has to invest in other people. Maybe he lends it to the fisherman who then builds a boat to increase the amount of fish the fisherman can catch for everybody. So what happens over time in a free market with perfect money, prices go down forever and quality goes up forever.
So just that last word that he said there, in a free market with perfect money, prices go down forever and quality improves forever. So not many of us have thought about what our money is doing to the quality of goods in our life. We've probably thought about what it's doing to prices, and we can all see that. That kind of hit me. So at the start on Joe's Island, there's two monies, and they're both, let's call it perfect or really good. And so on both sides, prices going down, quality going up. But what would happen if the money wasn't perfect? Maybe it would look something like this. So this is also from the Reserve Bank, and that blue line is what we call base money. So that's notes and coins they issue, commercial deposits with the Reserve Bank. And you can see that spike around 2021 when they created new money. And the top one is what we call broad money. That also includes lending. So money can be created in a couple of ways. There's the big red button, and there's also lending, fractional reserve banking. Money is created to lend. But we'll refer back to this slide a bit later on. But that's the monopoly game again. So we're in this game when the money that we're using, every dollar we use, and we use over time, the supply of it is getting increased more and more and more. And it's just really simple maths. The more New Zealand dollars exist in an economy, the less each one of them will buy.
That is, until these guys are not. So now, because the society is growing and the population is growing, both sides of the island elect government. Now, it doesn't matter if the government is left or right, big, small, up, down, it doesn't matter. They are all the same when it comes to this. Now, however well run the government is, inevitably it will hit a deficit at some point. And that means it's spending more than it's receiving. And that could be through mismanagement, but it could just be through external circumstance, like a natural disaster or something like this. The causes are not important, but it will happen over the course of time, inevitably. But now we see a divergence across both sides of the island. Satoshi, he only has two choices here. To balance the budget, he needs to either raise taxes or cut spending, or maybe a combination of the two. Whereas Fiatello, he has exactly the same choices, but he also has a big red button. And the important thing here is they're both up for re-election. And Fiatello knows that if he raises taxes or he cuts spending, it's going to cost him votes. So just this time, he decides to press the big red button and print a little bit of extra money for the government.
So just this time, and New Zealand, we don't print, we haven't pressed the red button as much as others. We didn't do it after the GFC, but we certainly did it in 2021. The amount we printed was a bit less than others in terms of percentages of the supply, but we pressed it just this once. So what would happen, and as Joe said, it doesn't matter it's not a political thing, which government is in, everybody has done it. And he mentioned about government deficits. because a lot of the driver of this is, are we spending more than we earn? And the answer is yes, we are. So since the government is spending more every year than we earn, since there was a surplus 2018, we're spending more every year. $12 billion was our deficit last year. And how does that affect our debt? Well, it makes it go up, same thing. And again, in New Zealand, we always kind of hide behind this. It's not as bad here as somewhere else. So our 40-odd% debt to GDP, not as bad as the States at 130, not as bad as Japan at 200. But, look at that climb. And, think about this from your own household. If you are spending more every year than you earn, how does that end? And you're going into debt more and more every year at this rate. How do you feel about that personally? Most of us wouldn't feel great about that, but that's what's happening in our country, in the country's finances. And it seems a long time. 6 odd years ago, not that long ago, but no one's talking about balance, surplus. It's about spending more than we have, and on the other side of that, if things go wrong, then we have to go back to the big red button.
Okay, so what are the consequences? Well, for Satoshi, not great. He cannot hide those changes from the population because they're paying more in taxes or they're getting less back from the government from its spending. So he loses the election. But government reduces in size naturally. So now overall, the efficiency in the economy has increased. But not only this, the social balance is improved within the economy because people now realise there is no free money. Taxes need to balance spending. But the important thing is prices continue to fall and quality continues to increase. Now for Fiatello, great news, he gets re-elected. And to start with, it's consequence free. But he thinks this is the greatest thing ever. I get re-elected and there's no downside.
I was talking to someone, a guy I know about this lately, and he said to me, you've got to be careful because if you're not careful, then the government will have to balance its books. And I was just like, wow, we're at the point where the idea of, the government having balanced books is that far out of that, of normal conversation. So for those of you that go and watch the video, I'm not going to talk to every single slide on this. You can see there's a lot of stuff on this one particular slide. But basically, Joe talks through the downstream effects of increasing the money, pressing the big red button. And it's basically warping the prices of things. The price is a signal telling us what's working in a market. By creating more money, it's changing that signal. So it affects the way people spend money in terms of capital. Prices go up. Consumer prices. It's costing businesses more money for things. They're dropping the quality of things, dropping the quantity of things. And what it really does is puts the price of inflation up. Now, everybody in New Zealand, or many people in New Zealand, are using their house as their savings account and their long-term savings. And I'll show you in a slide in a minute, but if the money supply is going up and up and up and up, what happens to house prices? What happens to asset prices? They go up and up and up. And there's a lot of and as Joe talks, he kind of ties all these in and, look at each one, and you can identify things in New Zealand of how they look like, but like I said, this was his most complex slide. But the end result is that increasing the money supply has a lot of downstream effects, and it leads to social problems, and the solution for those problems is so often just more government help, which means spend more money, which means the books are more out of balance, and then we lurch around to the next crisis. And so one interesting thing, there's something called the price theory of money, which basically talks about inflation is only and ever a result of the money supply. So that's that monopoly board again. What happens to the prices of properties on the monopoly board if the banker puts in more money again, more money again? And it's just paper money. So that's our money supply curve there, up and to the right, just like a nice looking Bitcoin price chart. That is New Zealand house prices. That top red one is house prices over the same timeline from 2000 to about 2020, and that is consumer price. The timeline is a little bit off on that right one. It's about halfway along that line is 2000. So it just raises the question, what would inflation look like if we weren't increasing the money supply with paper money every year or every crisis? It would look very different, I think.
The banana is lurching from crisis to ever bigger crisis. He presses the big red button, which debases the currency, which leads to bigger government and more involvement in everything. And now not only is the government bigger, but the government has spawned a series of parasitic industries attached to it. Big pharma, who are increasingly involved with the government to try to deal with the symptoms, but not the causes of the various health crises. Never incentivized to actually cure a patient, just to treat them long term, because a healthy customer is a lost customer. Big food pushes for ever lower food standards across the economy. The military-industrial complex pushes for ever greater spending on defence, both at home and on foreign shores. Wall Street are up to their eyeballs in debt, and now so leveraged that the government wants to protect them. They can't be allowed to fail, because if the banks fail, the population loses their money, the government falls. The government also continues to make unproductive investments. Investments trying to deal with the secondary issues it's created, but also investments driven from whatever political ideology the government has. And all of these things are effectively now crony corporatism. It's very hard to see where the government ends and these industries begin. The success of the government is deeply intertwined with the success of the industries. These industries start to ask the government to become regulators. You need to regulate us to protect the public. But this regulation, all it does is make competition harder. The 1, 2, 3 companies in each of these areas are now very, very close to the government. They supply the people for the regulator. When the regulators end their tenure, they go back and work for these companies. It stops smaller companies coming in and competing with them to then supply the government on better terms with higher quality product. So quality starts to decline and prices start to rise.
Some of those things that he talked about, we don't see so much in New Zealand. I don't see a industrial war complex in New Zealand. Big pharma, maybe yes, maybe no. So it's a different flavour here, but you can see it existing. And look, one question is I always think about, and especially if you come to New Zealand from overseas, competition. Why we don't have a lot of competition in industries like these ones. I learned recently that when a supermarket goes into and they're the anchor tenant in a mall, a new mall development, they sign into their contract that they forbid the fresh produce or vegetable shops to be as tenants in the same mall. And I was like, whoa. Things like that, banking. Lightning Pay guys are talking about some of the challenges they've had just to do something as simple as getting a bank account, and something that's an innovation and giving more customers. That's what we see in New Zealand, and we'll see it when we try and fly around New Zealand domestically, things like that. And there's a really interesting website, I don't know if any of you listen to, there's a quarterly monetary base update that a guy called Matthew Mazinskis does, and he's on the TFTC podcast. And he tracks the base money of all currencies around the world. And since they were tracking New Zealand dollar, late 1980s, our 16% money supply increase every year. So every New Zealand dollar you're holding over time in the last 30, 40 years is decreasing in purchasing power, 16% a year. And how does that affect us? If you're working on fixed wages, it makes it harder. What we call a middle class, harder. In New Zealand, if someone we're calling wealthy, maybe they've got a couple of properties, it's still harder because your property is going up in numeric terms, but it's not buying you more, and especially if you just need another house. And what it does is basically, and this is the way I explain Bitcoin to people, is it's basically better money for 95% of the world, and the 5% at the top that are in control of the money and decision makers at the top. Maybe they don't like it, but everyone else, it's better money for.
But now so much time has passed that the wall down the middle of the island starts to crack. And it starts to crack in such a way that both people and money can start to flow from one side to the other. So on the one side you've got the Satoshis, increasing their purchasing power at 3% a year. On the other side you've got the Fiatellos that are losing 7% purchasing power every year. So what happens? Why? What Fiatello starts to see is that money and people start to leave because they don't trust their ability to save using Fiatellos. They want Satoshis. Okay, so this sums it up. On a Fiatello standard, your money is stealing from you. Whereas on a Satoshi standard, the whole world is working 24/7 to increase your purchasing power. But now the escape valve is open. People realize they can't save in Fiatellos. So they start selling Fiatellos to buy Satoshis. So the Fiatellos decline further in value, triggering yet more budgetary and currency crises for Fiatello to deal with. And the only choice is to press the big red button again. But this time, for each piece.
So the cycle goes round. And interesting stat, I was talking to my friend at breakfast today, is that every fiat currency that exists in the world has basically gone extinct, except for the ones that are here now. And it's hard to know what happens with fiat. Inflation, we know it's baked in, it's happening. Hyperinflation, we don't know. Around the world you see examples of asset seizures. In the past you have military dictatorships, communism. We don't feel like that's, well, we probably didn't until 4 years ago, feel like that's something that we have to face. And you're certainly seeing around the world war, conflict, internal and external. But what is true is that, the escape valve is now here, and people want the better money, and that will always cease to exist, the better money. So I'm just going to move. There's just a chart. He's tracked some of those qualities of money and comparing the good money, the perfect money, our money, and the US dollar. And what happens is that in New Zealand, everything we need to buy, like foreign goods, particularly oil and gas, or oil, petrol, we're having to pay in New Zealand dollars. So as the US dollar is being debased, we're in a secondary currency, the New Zealand dollar. So it's being debased against the US dollar. So this chart is the New Zealand dollar, US dollar exchange rate for the last, again, is that 10 years, I think. So every time that debases, that's our New Zealand dollar debasing the US dollar. So we've got like one poor currency on top of another poor currency. And that affects us in New Zealand with the prices we pay. So the consequence, so that red line is the US money supply, and the blue line is their debt. So you can really see that they just track each other, and we're on top. We're on top of that, or we're going back to the US dollar. So we're the poor cousin. Now this chart here shows the last 10 years performance of all currencies against the US dollar. New Zealand dollar, 28% loss in the last 10 years. And it's been going on for a long time, and it doesn't look like it's changing. But the good news is, there is a solution. Now this is a quote from an Austrian economist, Hayek, and the history of government management of money has, except for a few short happy periods, been one of incessant fraud and deception.
That would all be pretty depressing if it wasn't the solution. Thankfully, there is. The only solution here is the separation of money and state. The government cannot be allowed access to a big red button. And Hayek again, and this time the quote's from 1984. I don't believe we shall ever have good money again until we take it out of the hands of government. We can't take it violently out of their hands. All we can do is, by some sly, roundabout way, introduce something they just can't stop. Brilliant quote. So I hope now, with these links between the big red button and the money printer, and all of these issues that we see in our lives today, that it's now much clearer that if we can fix the money, we'll fix the world. And the good news here, and this is the best news, is that Satoshis are real. And even Fiatello is now a convert. The solution is Bitcoin. One Bitcoin is 100 million Satoshis, in the same way that $1 is 100 cents. Now you may feel you know about Bitcoin already because of something you've been told by friends, or you read in the media. I would encourage you to start again. When we derive our information from media or people who have derived their information from the media, and that media is connected to the people who own and benefit from the money printer, it tends not to be necessarily the most accurate information. So, don't trust, verify. Come to satsversusfiat.com. We set up a website which helps people get up and running.
So as Joe says, the good news is there's a solution. Having to my friend this morning, that's what I'm going to do, is basically learn about Bitcoin and get to the point where you're comfortable to hold it. Joe has made this whole project fully open source. There's this website here. If you haven't seen the video, go have a look. There's a whole bunch of stuff to download, to read. And my call to action for everybody after this is just go watch the video. and share it with friends. And if you want to learn more about Bitcoin in New Zealand, take a look at Kiwi Bitcoin Guide. So, thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Awesome.